Today we're going to talk about African American vernacular English. The discussion is from an article titled AAVE, or African American Vernacular English is not standard English with mistakes. The writer is Pullum, and in the rest of the discussion we'll see what AAVE is and what it is not. Before I start the discussion, I have some statements to make because there are a lot of stereotypes about AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. The first thing is that AAVE has other names. People call it black language, some call it African American language, some call it Ebonics. But most of the linguists have adopted AAVE as a technical term to refer to this variety of English, and we'll stick to this term for that reason as well. We also need to know that AAVE is not limited to African American people. Anyone can speak AAVE. Also, not all African American people speak AAVE. In fact, 80 to 90% of them do, according to Lipigram. Anyway, so you will possibly know from your personal experience, the vast majority of AAVE speakers in the US are actually bidialectal. They speak both standard American English and also the AAVE variety of English. And there are second language learners of AAVE. Some people speak AAVE, but they did not know it growing up. They later learned it, either because it is part of their culture or just they wanted to know more about it. Another point, a very good one, is that people can make mistakes in speaking AAVE, just like in any other variety of English. So a lot of people think that AAVE is just full of mistakes, that you cannot make mistakes in it because everything is a mistake already. And that is not true. The writer says AAVE has a rule-governed grammar. And for any variety of any language really, the grammar is inevitable. It will be there. Maybe it is a different kind of grammar, but the grammar is there. And any resistance to this concept is futile. And the people who ignore this fact for AAVE is actually demonstrating ignorance, condescension, and disrespect. Also, there is a great deal of regional and social variation in AAVE. So African American vernacular English doesn't look or sound the same in all parts of the country. Our article starts with a mention of a media frenzy over Oakland. So Oakland school board decision here, of course. So the question you might ask is, why did the Oakland school board decision create a countrywide media frenzy? And what was wrong with it, if at all? And what was the decision actually? Why did the board take such a decision? And what do we think about it? These are some good questions you need to ask. And I have the answers as well here. So to begin with, the board stated a revision of their educational policy to address the struggling performance of AAVE speaking children by recognizing its legitimate status and training the teachers accordingly to deal with it. So there are like 1/3 of the Oakland School Board students who spoke AAVE as a first language, and they were struggling in schools, especially in reading, and the school wanted to do something about it. So they made this decision that we'll acknowledge AAVE as a distinct language so that we can make some changes. Actually, they wanted to use the ESL fund for the African American vernacular English speaking children, because if you speak, say, Arabic or German or Spanish, and if you are in good numbers in the school system, there will be a separate ESL class for you. But the children who speak AAVE, which is way different from, say, the mainstream American English, these children will not be eligible for any additional language support classes. So the school wanted to make it right. They wanted to improve their performance, and they wanted to legitimize AAVE as a separate language. Now, they did it because if they acknowledge it as a second language, they can use the federal funding to support these students. Anyway, the board members in the media were reported, they were vilified, ridiculed, and attacked in newspapers and magazines around the entire world. And there's one reason. Most speakers of Standard English think that AAVE is just a badly spoken version of the language, marred by a lot of ignorant mistakes in grammar and pronunciation. So people also call it a repertoire of street slang. And the concept of, they also called African American vernacular language Ebonics. So that created another part of the controversy as well. So we'll see here why that was problematic and what this AAV actually is. Now, is AAV a slang? But what is slang? The writer says slang is an expression that represents a vivid, colloquial word or a phrase associated with some subculture and not yet incorporated as part of the mainstream language. So it is localized use of a particular expression, So a slang is also parasitic on some larger and more encompassing host language. So slang is not a language itself. It's like it lives on, feeds on a bigger language. And a slang has no grammar of its own. It is just mainly a small array of words and phrases, and no subculture slang could constitute a separate language of its own. So African American vernacular English is not a slang. It is something else. It is greater than that. So what is AAVE then? Is it a language? The school board decisions may acknowledge that AAVE is a separate language. And in fact, if you think of the languages in the world, they have some criteria, like they are spoken by a community of speakers, and they also have a distinct orthography or writing system, and they have a cultural history as well. So, in fact, politically speaking, there have been a number of languages in the world that are almost the same, but they have been called language. One example is Urdu and Hindi. These two languages are the same, but because they are spoken by two distinct groups of people, like people in India speak Hindi, and most of them are Hindus, but people in Pakistan speak Urdu, and most of them are Muslims, and they have a different writing systems as well. But Hindi and Urdu are basically the same language. But because of the politics, because of the religious affiliation and the country affiliation of these two languages, they made the two names of the same language. Anyway, so a lot of people think that AAVE is a language. But most linguists would say that AAVE is a dialect, is a variety of English. There are many varieties of English throughout the world. So British English is a dialect of English. Indian English is a dialect of English. So American English is a dialect of English. So AAVE is also a dialect of English. Some people may call it an accent as well. We learned in the previous classes that accent is the way people sound, the way of saying something, So even if you get rid of the grammatical and the vocabulary features of AAVE, there is still the accent, the way people sound when they speak AAVE. So AAVE then can be a language, it can be a dialect, but it can also be considered an accent. The writer in the rest of the article is establishing some facts about AAVE and making it clear that African American Vernacular English is a rule-governed language system. It has a grammar of its own, syntactically speaking, phonologically speaking, and it is not just full of mistakes. Rather, it is a dialect of its own. So the first rule, the feature that the writer advocates here is that there is a myth about African American English that they drop be verbs all the time, like how you doing. So instead of saying how are you doing, AVE speakers would say how you doing, and this be, in this case how are you are, has other forms. So be is an auxiliary form, or also called copula. There are variations of it, say be, am, is, are, was, were, been, being. So there are a lot of variations of the same word be in English. So the myth is that it is carelessly omitted or used in incorrect forms. So like be, out of ignorance. So that's the myth. What's the reality? The writer says be dropping is rule governed. Be can be omitted only when the copula be verb is in present tense, not in first person, when the be is not accented, when the be is not negative, and when the be is not expressing the habitual or the remote perfect tense. So there is a lot of rules to follow before you can actually drop the be in AAVE. In fact, Russian, Arabic, Swahili, and many other languages have rules for omitting be. So African American English is not the only one. And we'll see some examples. And this is important because we need to deconstruct the myth that AAVE speakers drop their be verbs all the time. No, they don't. So when not to omit be? See, if the copula or the be verb bears accent or is stressed for any reason, it is not omitted. Look at the example. There already is one. So is in this case is accented or emphasized. So you cannot omit this be verb. So AAVE speakers will not omit it. Auxiliary verbs at the end of a phrase are always accented and retained. So couldn't nobody say what color he is? So is at the end of the sentence is always retained. It will not be omitted. Also, there is a special remote present perfect tense, completely lacking in standard English. Like in the sentence, she's been married. It means she is married and has been for some considerable time. And this is a kind of tense not available in mainstream American English, and many people think that this is a mistake, which is not. And also been in this case is not omitted. The next point is if the copula is negated, if it is in negative form, it is not omitted. Like the form ain't is never dropped. I ain't no fool. So ain't is a form of a be verb and it is not dropped. This copula or be verb is not omitted when it is infinitive or in the base be form. Like you got to be strong. So be will not be omitted here. Be careful. In this case, people will not drop be if they are speaking AVE. Now, the be that expresses habitual aspect is also not omitted. He be singing. What do you think it means? I asked this a lot of people, and most of them say that he be singing means he is singing, which is not true. He be singing is another habitual aspect, present tense in AV, and it is not available in the standard American English. So it means he usually or habitually sings. He's an artist, he's a singer, right? And this be is obligatory here. The copula is not omitted when it is in the past tense as well, was or were. So I was cool. So was or were, these are be verbs in the past. They will not be omitted. The present tense copula is not omitted when it is first person singular, am. I'm all right. So am is not going to be omitted. The copula is obligatory in an interrogative as well. Is that you? So it starts with the auxiliary verb is. So it will not be omitted. The copula of the tag is obligatory as well. So say, I don't think you are ready, are you? So in this case, are is not going to be omitted. Now, the second point that the writer highlights in this article is that AVE uses double negation. And a lot of people think that's illogical. Why use two negatives in the same sentence? So is it not illogical? Look at these sentences. I ain't no ugly dude. He didn't see nothing. Or I ain't never seen anything or nothing like it. Point is, unlike in standard English, negation can be multiply marked in AVE. So, in fact, there are other varieties of English. Cockney, a working class dialect in London, is another English dialect having the same feature. In fact, this double negative is also called negative concord. AVE is one of the negative concord languages like Italian, Spanish, and Polish, which record the use of negative words instead of indefinite words. So whenever there are indefinite words in a sentence, like in this sentence, I haven't ever seen anything like it. So if you want to transfer it to AVE, then it will sound like this. I ain't never seen anything like it. So ever is an indefinite word, so we see never, and anything is also an indefinite word, and it becomes nothing. So just because there are two negatives in a sentence doesn't make it a mistake. It is a standard feature of the dialectal variety. In fact, the writer is also saying the people who say that two negatives make it a positive, which is not true, because language is not math. Language is different from math. It doesn't work like math. It is different. The writer also makes a case for a negative inversion, that a key feature of AAV involves repositioning a negative auxiliary verb at the beginning of a sentence when the subject is indefinite. Look at this sentence. Ain't nobody gonna find out? Translates into mainstream English. Nobody is going to find out. So we have a negative at the beginning of the sentence because we have a subject that is indefinite, which is nobody. And I will skip some of these sections here. You can read it on your own. Another thing that the writer mentions is that people think AV speakers drop consonants all the time, which is not true. The writer says AV also has special principles for pronunciation, like the one involving consonant clusters at the end of words, like test, desk, left, respect. The rule is this: a stop consonant at the end of a word can be omitted, and usually is, if it is preceded by another consonant of the same voicing. Look at the example test. You don't have to understand all this linguistic terminology. Just understand why this word test will be often pronounced as test. So the writer says this voiceless stop T sound can be dropped after voiceless S. So what you need to understand that there are rules for pronunciation. So desk becomes desk for a reason. Left becomes left for a reason. Respect becomes respect for a reason. So everything that a typical AAVE speaker does is rule governed. You need to know that. So African American vernacular English has a grammar of its own, has a rule of its own, and a lot of rules of its own. And we should not consider it a standard English with mistakes. Rather, it is a kind of English on its own. There are many varieties of English. Say, if someone speaks British English in the US, we do not consider them speaking incorrect English, do we? No. But we tend to think of that in terms of the AAVE speakers, because when AAVE speakers speak the language, we think they are making mistakes. So we are judging AAVE speakers based on the standards of a different variety of English, that is Standard American English, for example. So we need to judge AAVE speakers based on the rules of their own language. And as we discussed in the previous lectures, language differences are not meaningless. They reflect on us. They reflect on our identity. They reflect who we are. And we need to respect people for who they are. And if we do not do that, if we stigmatize because people speak differently, write differently, it will be equal to stigmatizing their entire culture. And we cannot do that. So that's it for today. Thank you very much.